Hello scholars, it's Mr. Alan again. I'm your science host. Today we'll be looking at the topic food chains and food webs and the interconnection between a food chain and a food web, as you can see on this diagram showing the connection between food chain and food web because they have something in common. Now a food chain shows the transfer of energy within an ecosystem. When this happens, energy is transferred from one organism to another in order to release energy for their growth and development. So a food chain is simply a feeding relationship between two or more organisms in a linear manner, releasing energy. And a food web, on the other hand, is a complex feeding relationship between two or more organisms in a given habitat. Now, food chains and food webs are what biologists describe as a relation between animals in their habitat and the foods they eat. A simple food chain actually would be the sun grows the grass, because grass or plants depend on the sun through photosynthesis to make their food. The deer eats the grass and the wolves eat the deer. So in this relationship, there's a feeding relationship, releasing energy from one animal to another. If something goes wrong with one animal, then it will reflect on all the other animals. So if we have a drought, then no grass will grow because drought will make plants to die. There will be no water for them to grow, and the deer will not find food to eat. So in that case, there's starvation in the food chain. All right, let's talk about the types of carnivore. On the other hand, are animals that eat only other animals, or you can say they eat flesh or meat alone or material. Then consumers generally feed on one organism for the release of energy. So this is an example of a food pyramid. We call this a food pyramid, showing the relationship between animals in a food chain. Another example of a food chain. In this food chain, here we have plants growing and goat feeds on the plant, man feeds on the goat, and so on. Now in the next picture, here is another good example of a food chain where we have the sun serving as the source of energy for the plants to grow. We call the plants producer. Then the grasshopper in turn feeds on the plants here, or the grass. The frog feeds on the grasshopper. The snake feeds on the toad in return. And eventually the hawk feeds on the snake, and the cycle continues. Another example of food chains, as you can see in this picture, we have decomposers. We always be the last in the chain because they help to decompose the body of dead plants and animals in order to continue the cycle and fertilize the soil. So in a nutshell, as you can see in this picture, the producer is the grass. They are fed upon by grasshopper. A bluebird feeds on grasshopper. A snake feeds on the bluebird. The owl feeds on the snake, and so on. Another example here, as you can see, this is a food web. A food web is a complex feeding relationship between more organisms in a given habitat. Here you can start from any point. On the plant, the goat can feed on this plant. The rabbit can also feed on the plant. Then the lion can feed on any of these animals in this complex feeding relationship. Another food web here, as you can see, where many animals are interrelating at the same time. That's why you have many arrows showing the feeding relationship. So you can pause the video and study the pattern in which the animals are feeding on each other, starting from the producer being the plant. This is a good example of a food chain in an aquatic habitat, that's a water environment, where we have the dinoflagellates. They are tiny plants actually in the water. They are fed upon by what we call copepos, as you can see as the primary consumer here. Then the ocean sunfish feeds on the copepos, the shark feeds on the ocean sunfish, and eventually a larger shark feeds on the small shark. So in summary, in this aquatic environment or habitat, the food chain proceeds from the producer, which is the energy from the sun. It goes through to the dinoflagellates, which are tiny aquatic plants. We can also call them phytoplanktons. They are fed upon by copepos, and copepos are fed upon by ocean sunfish to release energy for its activities, while a small shark feeds on the ocean sunfish for its own food or prey, and it goes on to the large shark. So if you look at the organization of trophic level here, what we call trophic or feeding level, it goes from the producer to the primary consumer, to the secondary consumer, the tertiary consumer, and finally the quaternary consumer. That's the highest level of consumers we have among the consumers in a food chain or a food web. So this brings us to the end of this class, but in summary, or in a nutshell, the essence of food chain and food webs is to release energy for organisms to survive in their habitat. So the Smart or the strong organism will always outsmart the weak organism, as propounded by Charles Darwin, which says in the animal kingdom, it is survival of the fittest. So one organism preys on another in order to get its energy release. Thank you so much for your time. Have a nice day.